Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone to FashMash Pioneers, the monthly speaker series where Rachel, Arthur, and I bring together the brightest minds shaping the future of fashion. For those new here today, FashMash was founded 8 years ago with one core mission: to drive forward the future of the industry through open conversation and sharing of ideas. And welcome to our best-selling talk of the entire year. I am delighted to say that this evening has far surpassed all of our most successful talks in terms of popularity. Biodiversity in the context of fashion is new to me. I'm going to put my hands up here, as I'm sure it is to many of you. That makes it even more exciting to know that so many of you were interested in attending this evening. As always, FashMash is here to be the source of ideas from the most trailblazing pioneers of industry. And Helen is certainly that this evening. Tonight's success is all the more gratifying because we have been raising funds for Conservation International, Helen's charity of choice, and where she is devoting much of her time now she is on sabbatical at present from the Kering group. Thank you so much for helping us to raise funds. Since the pandemic, we do not charge for tickets, but instead ask for charity donations each month to a charity of the speaker's choice. We also support the charity each month from FashMash as a company. This year, we have supported the Prince's Trust, the Emergency Designer Network, and SmartWorks, to name just a few. I also wanted to say a big thank you before we begin this evening to Klaviyo, our sponsor. They are an e-commerce marketing for brands of all kinds and all sizes, from 111 Skin to Skinny Dip. And FashMash, we have moved over our marketing to their platform. And really what differentiates it for us is that it has precision targeting, very precise insights, but also really personable staff behind it and a brilliant team. And that is what makes all the difference for us, as I'm sure it does you. When you need help and you need efficient advice, they are brilliant. So let's kick off with a question. Did you know there's a direct link between fashion and species extinction? As we have discovered in so many areas of sustainability this year, it's time to stop siloing different impacts. Their interconnection is paramount, as we discovered via our October Pioneers talk with Bandana Tiwari. In fact, my co-founder Rachel, who will be interviewing Helen this evening, would go as far as to say that biodiversity is the one topic we all need to know about in relation to fashion and the climate crisis. Restoring natural ecosystems, protecting species, it's one of the industry's biggest yet least known challenges today. This evening, Dr. Helen Crowley is just the person to define and demystify this topic. She is arguably the world's foremost expert on the intersection between fashion and biodiversity. As I mentioned, she's currently on sabbatical from the Kering group. She is working for Conservation International on this very topic. It is one of the 3 pillars of the G7 Fashion Pact. In fact, Helen is crafting their program of work, providing science-based methodologies and guidance for fashion companies to meet their biodiversity commitments. At Kering, in her role as Head of Sustainable Source of Innovation, Helen advises and supports the group's portfolio of luxury brands to implement best practices in sustainability, from animal welfare standards to raw material sourcing. Helen's career spans over more than 20 years, and it has seen her witness the evolution of businesses taking environmental challenges and just grouping them under health and safety to now far more sophisticated corporate sustainable CSR strategies. Prior to Kering, she worked for over a decade with Wildlife Conservation Society. She has a PhD in zoology from the Australian National University and is on the board of many non-profit organisations, including Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Phew. I told you she had quite a CV and that she was the expert in this field. I hope I have done her justice. I am so excited to listen to this interview. Far too often, sustainability discussions they just cover the same topics, and they speak in platitudes and they use buzzwords, and I feel that this is really going to drive conversation forward, which is what we always aim to do at FashMash in every one of our discussions each month. So before I hand over to Rachel and our speaker this evening, I just wanted to say, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, share your questions for Helen, and we have a dedicated section at the end of the evening for that. Also, please do use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. You can share any of your thoughts as the conversation is ongoing, and we very much look forward to seeing them, as well as obviously social media. We are at FashMash and we are #FashMash. Right. Now, time to hand over to Rachel and Helen. Please turn your videos on. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Rosanna. And hi, Helen. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to jump straight in because we have so much to talk about and limited time. Set the scene a little bit. Last year, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published a report that said nature is being eroded at the most unprecedented rate seen in human history. The part that caught my eye was a headline in The Guardian from Sir Robert Watson that said, "The loss of biodiversity is just as catastrophic as climate change." Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what that means on the one hand, and what fashion has got to do with it?
Okay, great. Well, let's start with the big question then. Thank you. What a pleasure to be here. Thanks for a lovely introduction, Rosanna, and great to be with you all, and please send your questions in. So the last 40 years has seen, sadly in my lifetime, and I feel a certain amount of guilt about this, let me say, an incredible decimation of life on Earth. It has been not only the ecosystems, so the actual sort of the habitats, the forests, the deserts, the coral reefs, not only have they been degraded and lost, but also species. So individual plants, animals, insects, fungi, they've been lost because we live for 5 main reasons. Climate change, invasive species, so when a species comes in and takes over where it shouldn't be, pollution, use, where we overuse the species, harvest something, whether it's fish, whether it's forests, and the big one, land and sea change, land use change, sea change. Because of those 5 reasons that we call drivers, we've grown our footprint as humans, and we've scrunched the footprint of the natural world and biodiversity. And doing so, we have lost a lot. So it is alarming, and it is a crisis, and they're calling it the nature crisis, and it's interconnected with climate. You cannot solve the climate crisis without looking at natural climate solutions, and we'll get back to that. You can't get to where we want to get to at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming or less unless we look at nature. And we've got to start. The forest, just simply the loss of forest, is the 3rd largest emitting country. If you just wanted to look at forest loss,
wow,
the 3rd largest emitting country after China and the US. Well, I'm not sure how that's changed in the last few months, but the point is nature and climate are interconnected, and we'll talk about that because there's a very powerful suite of solutions because of that interconnectedness. So why does it matter that we're losing species, or we're losing an insect you've never heard of, or you feel sad because you might lose some nice cuddly furry animal that you're very attached to? But what does it really matter? So here's the thing. We all depend on nature, and it's not just an emotional and a spiritual and all those lovely things, and for our sector, inspirational connection. We absolutely are connected to nature and depend on nature. The air we breathe out, the CO2 we breathe out, goes into plants and gets converted into oxygen and comes back, and we breathe that oxygen. We're just, our whole, every time we breathe in and out, we are physically connected to the living environment. Not only that, it provides services. So that's a service, but it provides many services to us. Every service you could possibly name, from storm mitigation through to freshwater filtration through to soil fertility, It comes from nature and biodiversity and these natural processes that have been in research and development. I always say it's been 4 billion years of R&D. 4 billion years has created this amazing place, this living planet Earth. And we rely on all the goods and services and that interrelatedness for us. Now, I can get into more detail, but just, am I on the right track there?
I mean, that set the scene wonderfully, but connect that to fashion for me then. How does that come into it? I understand the breathing part, we need that, but how do clothes link in?
Okay, so I have to sort of set the scene that we all depend on it, right, for everything. And the World Economic Forum has did a report in June this year that they estimated at least half the global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So all of our business, so now getting into business is dependent on it. So it's not just sort of society and the way we breathe, but business. And particularly in fashion, because if you trace where your fashion comes from, where your clothes come from, where your textiles come from, there's a huge amount of it that comes from agriculture and forestry and mining. So fundamentally, we think of ourselves, as the fashion sector, but we're really fundamentally linked to the mining sector, to the oil and gas, as well as minerals from the earth, forestry, and agriculture. Now, remember I told you one of the biggest drivers of loss is agriculture and land use, and the way we use the sea, but for us, land use. So the way we use our forests and the way we use our land for agriculture is what's driving biodiversity loss. And it is also what's driving the nature that we are going to depend on. If we want soil to grow cotton, if we want soil to grow grass so that sheep can eat grass, so they can produce their wool and meat, if we want hemp, linen, if we want cellulosic fibers, if we need soil, we need water, we need land, we need biodiversity, we need a living system. So we're so inextricably linked to nature and the services that nature provides. And up until recently, well, up until now, because now we're going to start changing it, we've been sort of extracting all those services and those goods all over the world. The food, not just our sector. We've all just been out there like, oh, we're going to use that. We're going to use the soil and we're going to grow that. Then we're going to take that and we're going to turn it into something that we wear or we eat. Okay, but we haven't been giving back. We haven't been replenishing. We've just been taking out. Yeah. And the soil's been degrading. And we've been losing the forest and we're losing the services to help provide. So if we want our business to continue, we need to start looking to how we can support nature and replenish it while we still, get the goods and services that we would like, but doing it in a restorative, regenerative way, not as an extractive way. So we're really linked to that. We're really linked to nature, and we have an opportunity to switch that round.
So this is something that's obviously been talked about more and more, certainly in sustainability circles, maybe even 18 months, 2 years. I guess it's really been bubbling up within the fashion industry as something that we need to be more aware of and talking about. Do you think it's garnering the sort of attention that it needs from leadership to do something to change it now, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the last 2 years have been super exciting. And I can remember 2 years ago when we had some World Economic Forum meetings and we were saying, how are we going to get nature and biodiversity on the agenda? And let me just do a sidebar. I interuse nature and biodiversity. Biodiversity is simply living nature, okay? Nature, so a mountain without forest, without living nature would be a pile of rocks. Soil without nature and without biodiversity would just be dirt. So, the nature is still, you've got that physical nature, but what makes it living is biodiversity. So when I intersperse those, I'm talking about living nature, biodiversity. So, so a couple of years ago, we were saying, like, how are we going to get biodiversity on the agenda? How are we going to get nature on the agenda like climate has got on the agenda in businesses? Cut to now, it really is front and center. And it's front and center because of a sort of an alignment of a lot of issues. As you mentioned, the IPBES report, which is like the IPCCC report, when all the scientists of the world come out and say, here's the problem. There's not a lot to argue with. Here's the issue. And so that came out, plus, there was the Living Planet report. Then came out reports from the World Economic Forum saying, look, this is really connected to business. This isn't just a sidebar issue. Nature's not just a nice to have. We really need it. Biodiversity loss is one of the top 5 risks, global risks to business. And then came out more and more. So it all sort of started coming together that, whoa, hang on a minute. The scientists are telling this. Look around. We see that there's these problems. Plus, there's going to be this risk to our business. And so it's come together to really, really put it front and center in the discussion and on the agenda. Still got a long way to turn it around to do things to make a difference. But that's what was so remarkable about the G7 and what President Macron did, where he challenged, his corporate leaders to come forth with some ambitious plans for biodiversity, for climate, for oceans, right? So Danone led a coalition of companies on how to really look at biodiversity in their supply chains. And then he challenged the fashion sector to say, well, what are you going to do about these 3 issues? And so it was sort of more as a cross-cutting sector that cuts across all the issues. And, Francois-Henri Pinault, the chairman and CEO of Kering, stepped up and said, okay, we're going to get the fashion sector behind this and make some ambitious commitments. So that is the Fashion Pact that came out. And that is incredible in many ways. Well, 3 main ways. It's incredible because it's very ambitious. Firstly, there's no doubt what everyone's trying. Secondly, the actual breadth of companies that have signed up. And thirdly, the fact that it's a range of companies. So the breadth, when I say breadth, it's around 30% of the sector by volume. But also the types of companies across a sort of suite of different business models, some that are just starting their sustainability journey, some that are very sophisticated. So which brings to the whole collective action and coalition some really exciting times, because we've got to learn to create, we've got to create a pathway forward for everybody. It's not just the leaders, it's everyone. And then we're going to create a pathway to say, okay, now we're going to turn our biodiversity ambition, we've recognized it's important, into action. And that's a huge leadership move that is going to vault our sector, I think, very rapidly to be leadership in the way, and in any sector, in the way they deal with biodiversity and nature. And I would say the flip side of what's exciting about okay, there's a lot of nuts and bolts and technical details about how to make this work, but the interesting thing about, well, the exciting thing about nature, it's not just interesting, but is as I mentioned before, it's restorative and regenerative capacity, right? So that 4 billion years of R&D has created such an inbuilt resilience in the system that if you let it and help it, it can restore and regenerate itself. Now, that you don't have that in climate, right? Climate's about just stopping CO2 going out into the atmosphere, sucking it back down or avoiding emissions, reducing emissions, super important. But you don't have what you have in nature, which is we've got to stop the loss for sure, but then we can rebuild, then we can restore. Now, when a species is gone, it's gone. But if you change the way you do things, you can restore habitats, you can protect species, you can regenerate the soils. And that's where it's super exciting for us, because we can tell the most amazing stories about it based in fact and action. We can now make the value proposition of our clothes and our products linked back to positive outcomes for nature and the environment in a very real way. And that's the big adventure ahead of us.
It's a huge adventure, and it is really exciting. As you know, I sit on the storytelling side, and I'm really excited about being able to flip this to more positive actions and outcomes, and indeed stories. But and I want to come more onto that, because I think there's a lot more we could dive into. But first, because you've talked about the Fashion Pact there, and obviously you are leading the program of work under biodiversity through your work with Conservation International. Can you tell us more about, I suppose, first of all, the fact you've been on this sabbatical there for the past year?
Right.
What has that entailed? What have you been working on, and how does it then input into this program of work for the Fashion Pact, and what can we expect to see ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was super lucky that that Kering allowed me to take a sabbatical, which you're allowed to do it at a French company after a certain number of years. And the reason I did it was because I could see back in my old world, where I worked before in the NGO, conservation, academic world, there was a lot of great things happening around looking at how we measure biodiversity, how we track it, how we talk about it. And it wasn't getting translated to companies. Like, it is complicated. Well, actually, I've decided I'm not allowed to say that anymore. I'm not saying that anymore. It's because if you say it's complicated, people go, oh my God, it's complicated. And we don't want to start with that. But let's just say there are a lot of different things in when you look at biodiversity, and we can dive into some of those to sort of explain it out. But so point about the sabbatical was I could see there was a lot of great things happening, and I sort of wanted to get up to speed to understand, okay, what are they doing? Like, what is the latest science? What are the latest techniques out there to understand change in nature and so on? And then I wanted to translate it back for companies, particularly in our sector, but for companies in general, to sort of like translate that, to take that and sort of turn it into something that's useful and powerful for companies to make decisions. And that's what I've been doing at Conservation International. Now Conservation International has built a team that is going to help the Fashion Pact companies. And let's be clear, it's not just the Fashion Pact. The Fashion Pact companies are the ones stepping up, but there'll be a lot of what we do will be open to everybody. You know, we've got some global environment facility funding. So we've got some funding for 2 years, which means a lot of our work will be all open sourced, and people will be able to see the techniques and hopefully want to get involved in the methodologies. So we're going to figure out how we're going to create a roadmap for setting a biodiversity strategy and ambition for fashion companies and implementing on that and being held accountable for it, but also being able to show how you're moving to being a positive, not a negative influence on the natural world.
Got it. I mean, so we've obviously got we see lots of targets being set by the industry around climate, you know, X% of carbon emission reduction by 2030, et cetera, et cetera. Are we going to have something along those kind of lines for nature as well then?
Yeah, there's, well, you know, what's really sort of rallied the corporate sector to set their targets appropriately is the Science Based Target Initiative that came out of Paris. And so that that's the Science Based Target Initiative is around setting your emissions reductions for climate. Science Based Target for nature, the Science Based Target Network, is about setting it for nature. It's a new initiative. We've been working on it intensively for about 10 months, but it's been going for a couple of years. A lot of the best of the scientific and conservation community come together and say, okay, what are we going to ask companies to do? Because it's not just what you do, it's how much do you have to do it and where do you do it? Because the thing about nature that is a bit different to a ton of CO2 is that it's very location specific. So what's happening in one part of the world isn't necessarily equated to what's happening in another part of the world. So how do you help companies? How do you create a framework where a company can set the right target that says, this is what I should be doing, this is how much I should be doing of it, and this is where I should be doing it. So that's what the science-based targets for nature are about. And you can go on the website as companies, you can join, there's a corporate engagement platform, and it's in the work, it's still being developed for the next couple of years. But what we're going to do is test out some of those targets and actions and start building that as an approach for fashion companies.
Got it. Super interesting.
Do you want me to give some examples?
Can you give us some examples? Because it's quite hard to imagine what that tangibly looks like when you say about different actions in different parts. So my brain immediately goes, because I'm really obsessed with this space anyway, as you well know, but you know, my mind goes to things like rewilding and stuff like that when we're talking about it in a much broader sense. And it's quite hard to imagine, having spent time in some rewilding places in the UK, what that looks like for a fashion brand. You know?
Yeah. No, it's true. So here's a way of thinking about it. And this is sort of the framework that the science-based targets for nature is based on. You've got, and it's developed, you've got a decision-making hierarchy. You've got things that it's called the mitigation hierarchy, but you don't need to remember that. It's basically saying, oh, first of all, here's my footprint. Here's what I'm doing around the world. and that's a very important caveat, you do have to have some idea of what you're doing around the world. Once you have some idea, where are the places in the world I need to avoid having any impact? Like tropical forests, old growth forests, for example. And, you know, there's some great initiatives in our sector already through Canopy to not source anything from old growth forests, from primary forests of the world. That would be an example of an avoid. We've got to stop. We've got to stop any conversion of forests from old growth forests. So that then there's a sort of another area. Okay, I've avoided impact where I can, then I'll reduce my impact. How do I reduce my impact? I move to more certified products that take into consideration reduction in chemicals, that look after, that make sure that species aren't affected badly. So whether it's responsible wool standard or whether it's wildlife friendly, so you can reduce. But then, and so you can start saying, okay, I'm reduced. So across my lands, I'm going to do X percentage certified materials and da da da. For example, I'm just giving you some ideas, sort of make it more. But then you get to the fun bits, the restoration and regeneration. So there you start saying, but I'm going to restore. I'm going to restore areas. I'm going to try and, I know that I could have an impact here. I'm going to try and help support restoration of natural forest in and around my farming landscapes. I can regenerate the soils through regenerative agriculture. I'm going to promote active regenerative agriculture in places where I source my wool or my leather or my cashmere. And then there's another piece of the action sort of framework called transform, which is how am I as a company going to go over and above just my impact to do more? Not just more physically in terms of, you know, maybe supporting protected areas more broadly, but also more in terms of advocating and supporting transformational change. So in our sector, what are you going to do as a company to go out there and support, you know, circular economy and regenerative raw materials? What are you going to do? Go out there to really help be more than the sum of our parts. We as individual companies can do so much, but then there's a point where we've also got to say, okay, we're moving as a sector to sort of transform the way we act in this world as a sector, as an entity. That, I know it sounds a little out there, and we're still working out the rules of the game on that one. But the point that I bring up on it is that it's quite exciting, because when you start talking about reduce and avoid, we've got to do that. But the restore, regenerate, and transform, it flips open a whole new way of thinking. Oh, what can I do to be transformative? You know, what can I do to really make a difference that goes beyond just my supply chains? How can I collaborate more, and so on? So I think this science-based target framework, this framework of thinking, is an important thing for us to really help sort of organize our actions and our priorities. So that's coming down the line, and you'll hear more about that in the coming year.
Super. I mean, it's so interesting, and thank you for that outline, because I think that really helps paint a picture for everybody about, you know, what this actually looks like and what the industry can start actively doing. It brings up so many sort of further thoughts, and I have so many things I want to ask you, but I guess one of them, you know, first of all, is really around, it sounds as though quite a lot of the work then, by its very nature, of course, is on the ground work. You know, we have to be physically in these places, and as you say, lots of them are different in different places around the world in terms of what those strategies might be if we're looking to restore, for instance. Given the fact that, you know, so many of the fashion brands within this industry don't have control over their supply chain, you know, in many cases don't even know, you know, the farmers that are actually supplying them, because it goes so far back and it's so fragmented. How much influence can the industry itself have? And I guess more to the point then, you know, you've said about collaboration, but as an individual brand working within this, you know, how much can you actually do?
Yeah, good point. Well, here's the thing. I know it's overwhelming, and I know it's hard, but firstly, let me just say a big thing about traceability and transparency in supply chains. And traceability is one thing where you can trace. Transparency is how you articulate that out to your wider stakeholders. So it is so coming. I mean, whether you like it or, I know it's complicated, but third parties are able to trace what the flow of commodities and the flows of supply chains, even without corporate data. So somewhere you've got to face up to knowing where stuff comes from, at least to a country level, right? Even if you don't get to farm level, you've got to know where your stuff comes from, which is where certification does help you. Certification is just a step to get to where you need to go. It's not the end result, but it helps you because it does help have some traceability. So you are going to need, even if you don't know your farmers, you need to know where things are coming from, and you need to really sort of look at the key risks and make some hard decisions about that. If you are not doing anything certified in terms of your raw materials, then you're up at a lot of risk. I mean, gone are the days, for example, with forest. Let's just talk about forest, right? The scientist, everyone tells you, for climate, for nature, we've got to stop cutting down forests. We've got to stop degrading natural forests, certainly. So you cannot be sourcing from forests if it is not certified from sustainable forestry. It is just done. If you can't stop it, then you can't address biodiversity and nature. Maybe you can't for various reasons. Okay, but then you're not going to get to setting your targets and doing positive for nature. You just can't, right? So forests straight away. Think about, what am I doing that's linked to forest? Packaging, paper, cellulosic fibers, straight away. Second big thing's agriculture. What am I doing that comes from systems that might risk having an impact, a negative impact? And then you think, okay, well, wool, perhaps. Well, you can start thinking about, well, how can I get responsible wool, certified wool? Or, there are ways you can start sort of working through it. So don't get too overwhelmed. It's like, there's a logic to thinking through what you need to do. Looking at biodiversity in nature it's not completely different to what you've already been doing, okay? It's almost like you've got your sustainability approach and your sustainability strategy, and you sort of take a step to the left and you sort of look at it a little differently. You think, okay, hang on a minute, how's that affecting key species, key ecosystems? Maybe I need to do something a little differently there. Maybe I prioritize a little differently because I really want to have a difference. That might be a higher risk than I had thought it been a risk before. So it's building on a lot of what you're already doing. But there are I guess there are three things that I think people need to think, in our sector, need to think very seriously about. It's the forests, what's coming from my forests, and I've got to avoid and reduce any negative impact. Agriculture, let's talk about regenerative. Okay, there's the avoid and reduce your impact, but also where can I promote regenerative? And I know as an individual brand, you might not think you can do a lot, but you're in a context now where there's a lot of people talking about this. There's a lot of farmers, there's a lot of action happening. So another voice at the table helps sort of tip towards, things really happening, a collective action approach. So don't be shy about starting to push and talk with your suppliers and sub-suppliers. Well, hey, what about regenerative? Can I get my wool or my leather from a regenerative system?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Obviously, before we joined this call, for everybody watching, we were talking quite a bit about some of the emerging new brands and so forth that are sort of setting up from the beginning. And we saw the same with climate, obviously. Lots of new entrants obviously have such, and same with transparency, obviously, such ability to immediately set up in a way that is focused, in this case, being regenerative, for instance. But those aside for a moment, are there examples of established brands that are already making inroads on a biodiversity strategy?
Yeah, I mean, Kering has put out a biodiversity strategy, which links back to, its sustainability strategy. So here's the thing. I would say that when you want to deal with biodiversity in nature, you do, like I say, need to have a slightly different lens, and there'll be ways we can help. We as collectively will be developing approaches that can help. But you might just want to put it in as part of your sustainability strategy. It might be a biodiversity ambition. It might be a nature plan. It might be, I'm going to optimize my natural materials from regenerative systems. Already that is something, don't get overwhelmed by thinking, I have to have a big strategy. But there are more and more companies starting, I mean, all the Fashion Pact companies are committed to develop a biodiversity ambition, a plan, a strategy in the context of their own sort of business culture and business processes in sustainability. It might be separate, it might be integrated in the next year. So you're going to see a lot of companies coming out with this. And there's a lot, and that was going to start building a conversation, a discussion, a narrative for action that's going to create a real buzz, you know, because we're like, yeah, hang on a minute, I have to make sure that I've got to avoid that, reduce that, and I want to restore, and I want to be transformative, and it'll get everyone sort of thinking, hopefully, and acting.
Yeah. Well, this is it. It's about momentum, isn't it? So that's incredibly, exciting to think about. I wanted to jump back to the storytelling part because I thought that was really interesting. And I know a lot of our audience do work in the marketing space of the industry as well. And that's kind of fascinating because obviously there's lots of challenges there in terms of the way that sustainability teams and marketing teams interact and how to sort of take those strategies and translate them into reality. But just to revisit that storytelling piece, from your perspective, do you think it is things like regenerative agriculture then that can, I guess, have something that's consumer facing as a sort of positive story of fashion?
I think you're going to have to go there. Look, especially after what we've all been through, what the world's been through this year. And I mean, Business of Fashion talked about this being sort of a convulsive time for the industry and a very important time to reassess your value proposition, as discretionary spending may or may not rebound, but people have reconfigured in their mind what their values are to a certain extent. So your value proposition needs to be, well, it certainly needs to be authentic. So you're going to have to build it on some real, when we say stories, I've had this before, people say, Helen, oh, you shouldn't keep talking about stories. People think stories are made up. What I'm talking about is like a narrative. Stories are based on reality. They're authentic, the stories I'm talking about, because they're they can be powerful. And so, I think you have to, there's regenerative agriculture is like the best food for, pardon the pun, storytelling. It's about farmers and livelihoods. It's about welfare of animals. It's about restoring the soil cycles and the water cycles. It's about soil that goes from being dirt to something that bounces. And I can say that I've been on farms where you get out of the truck and the soil bounces. You can talk about the farmers, the soil, the microbes, the wildlife. It's all bringing back, talking about building back better, or you're rewilding or whatever. So there's a lot, I just saw recently Country Road as an Australian. I grew up loving that brand, and I just saw they've done a feature on Tasmanian wool growers.
Oh, cool.
And I'm from Tasmania, so I'm particularly was excited about that. And I think, you don't have to always go to the, talk about the farmer. You can talk about the outcomes but that you're trying to get to. And here's the thing. And to make an authentic story, I think we have to recognize that we are on, for want of a better term, journey. I know we're all exhausted because we're on so many journeys, but there's a transition that we have over the next decade. Well, let's say 5 years. It's not going to happen all tomorrow that we can do everything, right? So we build a narrative. We say, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we did this year. This is where we're going next. We did a bit more certification. We've showed, and this is where outcomes are more interesting, I think, than practices. So when you do a traditional certification, it was like, oh, you tick the box. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. But what we want to head to, and Savory Institute, the regenerative NGO that works with a lot of farmers around the world, does this, is you measure outcomes. You can say, oh, we found we've increased soil carbon by this, or we've increased biodiversity by this. And that's where we're heading, where we're going to measure our progress over time. And that'll help build stories. That'll also show to the world that we're actually getting to nature positive, or whatever we want to call where we want to go. Nature positive would be nice. Climate nature positive by 2030. But that you can show all along the way, there'll be little stories you can tell that builds to that narrative. And it's also, at the same time, you're showing the progress that you're making.
Yeah, and it's interesting you obviously just said there about 2030. You know, we don't have that long. 10 years is not a huge amount of time, and there is a lot of action that needs to be taken. And I think at the moment that sort of lens of positivity is really directed towards the circular economy. And I would just love your perspective on where these things, I guess, fit together. Is it, you know, is it about moving to something that's fully circular so that we don't need to extract from the land in the first place, for instance? And how do you kind of see those things intersecting, I suppose?
Yeah, look, you know, the circular, I'm just thinking how to say this. Of course, circularity is good. Like, there's nothing wrong with circularity, and building a more circular economy is obviously what we need to do from this linear extract economy. That being said, it's going to take us quite a while to put in true circular. I mean, I'm not talking about the little recycled issue here with polyester or what. I'm talking really building it where clothes back into clothes. There's some major infrastructure pieces that need to be put in place. Now, that's great, let's do it, but let's not get distracted that that's going to get us where we need to get to by 2030 we have a decade to turn climate and nature around, and I don't think we're going to be able to build the circularity to the extent that we need to by 2030. I could be wrong. But also I'll say the way circularity works in our sector is based on 3 principles. You know, it's based on upcycling and recycling, it's based on material efficiency, and it's based on regenerative inputs. Garbage in, garbage out. You don't put the good stuff in, you're not going to turn that wheel of circular fashion. It's just going to sort of deteriorate into not particularly nice fibers, fabrics. So there's a big piece of it is putting the good stuff into that system, right? So if you want to have regenerative, restorative outcomes for the world, which is what we need to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we need to restore habitats and restore nature so that we can survive. You have to be looking to that more positive, proactive approach, not just doing less bad and saying, what can I do that's regenerative and restorative? Not just what can I do to avoid, but the next step, what do I do to... So saying, well, if we get to circular, we're going to use less land. Land's not the issue. It's how we use the land that the issue is. Let's use the land better. Let's restore. It's not a question if there's not enough land. The land needs to be repaired. The land needs to be restored. So just if you put all your sort of eggs in the basket of circularity, it's going to take us a long time to get clothes back. And I'm saying, let's do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm sure someone's going to get very angry at me. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, but realize there's an element to that working, which is about regenerative, restorative materials. And that's what's going to drive that. Wool, and I know I keep coming back to wool, but I'm a Tasmanian. It's a lot of shit in Tasmania. I grew up with lots of wool sweaters. Wool, it's pre-configured for circularity. It's like the most brilliant material to keep going around. So, you know, let's sort of not just cherry pick the bets we want, and we all love technology and fun, but let's look at what we're trying to do as individual companies, as a society, and as a sector in a society by 2030. And we've got to go for regenerative, restorative. We've got to be proactive, not just doing less bad.
And I love that, because I know you don't want to use the word complex, but actually, you know, everything you're talking about comes with so much complexity, because the simple answer is there isn't a simple answer, right? It is about much wider systemic thinking. I mean, the fact that you just mentioned wool there, and obviously wool gets a really bad rap in other spaces when you look at its impact through some of the LCA analysis, and you know, and that's fascinating, because actually, as you've just explained, it can obviously be incredibly positive in lots of other ways.
Yeah.
I loved, you know, obviously we've spoken several times, and one of the things I wanted to just share with the audience, because it's really stuck with me, you said to me a little while ago, the question that you have to ask constantly is this going to have an impact on species? Can you just explain that a little bit? Because I thought that was such a good starting place for everyone.
Yeah, so that's what I guess I meant by step to the left a bit of your sustainability strategy and look at it with it's a species lens. Because, you know, ultimately, talking about nature and living nature, I mean, it's everywhere. It's like, so the scientific world or humans have decided to categorize it, call it biodiversity, the diversity of life, basically, and categorize it into genes, species, ecosystems, and there's some other and then services, ecosystem services, nature's contribution to people, but just think about genes, genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystems. But the sort of purest measure of the diversity of life is how many species you have, right? That's sort of the easiest, you know, it's not, and you need lots of species and lots of different types of species. So you need abundance and you need diversity. So if you want to think about, so we think about you know, when you think about sheep farming, so you might think, well, you know, the soil, okay, soil captures a lot of microorganisms and species. So, but let's put that aside for a moment. You think, okay, so these farms, they're sort of doing well on the soil and the sheep are happy and they're all, you know, the welfare seems fine. But what about all the animals moving across? What about in Patagonia, it would be puma. In Australia, it's wombats and kangaroos. And what about, I mean, our agricultural landscapes are like frontier lands. They're often places where other wildlife need to move across as well. And so how do we, you know, or there might be a little, you know, a little legless lizard that only lives in this part of the world, and it lives on little rocky outcrops in the farm. And that, you know, you need those little rocky places in the farm. So there's things you can do on, you think, okay, what are the species that live here? Maybe I can work with my producers to do little different things to really help them, help these different species. So that's where wildlife friendly comes in. And now the technology is such that you can actually sort of see, there are maps of the world that can tell you what species are, what types of species are in every sort of little tiny square meter, or 50 square meters, I think it is, of the world surface. So you can find that out. So you just think, oh, I wonder what is happening in terms of wildlife and plants in that particular area. And so that's sort of the species. But at the risk of, just on the complexity thing, if there's three things that you got to think about, as I've said, it's forests, it's your agricultural lands. So how do you restore and regenerate agricultural lands? How do you stop cutting down forests and protect and restore them? But the other thing that we didn't mention, it's also the pollution. I mean, we use hundreds, thousands of chemicals, and it's just ridiculous. Hundreds of them are carcinogens or neurotoxins, or to us, as well as animals and wildlife, and it all ends up in rivers. We have got to get really serious about chemicals. And I know there's a lot of good work, but if it's something you can prioritize also, it's that, and it's microfibers, not just consumer use, but the microfibers that are released in your supply chain. So if you really wanted to think, okay, what are the things I can do? Okay, stop cutting down forests, protect them where you can, and support sustainable forestry. Support regenerative restorative agriculture, because and stop polluting. And there you'll be well on your way to being nature positive.
I love it. And listen, I love the fact that, you know, in that answer there, for those people that don't come from this side of the industry, I love that, you know, most probably wouldn't imagine that they join a talk this evening about nature and sort of hear connections between fashion, wombats and legless lizards. So thank you for that, because that's, yeah, it's so fascinating and so interesting. I want to open it up to the floor to questions, because we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I know lots have been coming in. Just quickly before I do, I think you've probably covered this already, but I'd love to just hear maybe in a sort of a single sentence, you know, if you had to outline your hope for the fashion industry in terms of what it will look like with biodiversity impact in 10 years, by 2030, you know, what would that be if you were to sum that up?
My hope is that the majority of the companies would be able to say they're heading to be nature positive, and that their consumers, our clients, understand that they can have a positive impact through the clothes that they choose, just not less bad, but they're actually positive. But that we're really serious about it, and we're really measuring it. And it's not just stories for story's sake, it's stories based on real outcomes that we can show. And to do that, we have to be disciplined and focused, and we're not known for that. We've got to be disciplined and focused on the key issues that we need to tackle, that we can tackle as a sector, because I think that will provide us then with the foundation for having a whole new energy in our sector, in a way of us getting people excited about their clothes again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, thank you for painting such a picture of ambition, but importantly, and sort of an action, and hopefully soon a roadmap to actually get there as well. And we'll obviously be following. Let me invite Rosanna back and we can see what questions have come from the floor. I will hand over to the two of you. Thanks, Rosanna.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so questions from the floor. We have a lot and not much time, so there are a couple that kind of group together. I'm going to start with those. So first of all, Jenia Meniva, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. First of all, she said, what a brilliant conversation. And then she'd love to know, Helen, what do you think are the best ways for smaller brands to take part in these high-level conversations? And likewise, she gives a bit more explanation, but just for speed, I'm just going to tie it back to Nina Glass, who is asking something similar along the lines. She says, Helen comes from a luxury brand where there is more margin in fashion. How are leaders which are in a lower margin going to make the transition given these dynamics? What would be your recommendations? So yeah, recommendations for small businesses and businesses with a lower margin than luxury.
We build our supply chains based on margins and pricing and speed to market. Honestly, we have to reconfigure supply chains to be more just and be more equitable, not only in the way we treat people, but in the way we price things. There's no way around it. You know, ultimately, I think that more damaging raw materials are going to cost more. I mean, I think between regulation, legislation, whatever. But currently, commodities, so raw materials do cost a little less than sustainable materials, but not that much. So it's up to you to and it's not about luxury and margins. It's not about what we can do and you can't do. Everyone can reconfigure that pricing. And it's about the value proposition you create, the true value. I'm not saying like just the economic. You say, we pay a little bit more for our raw materials and our traceability, and then we can tell the stories and be authentic and create a value proposition. And you capture that somewhere. You are going to have to capture that. It's not going to mean that your clothes are luxury priced at the end at all. It just means you reconfigure the way you do your supply chains, because we all know the percentage that a raw material cost is in a finished product is quite small, right? So I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that's part of the package of moving forward in a transformational way and making the difference, and being able to tell the authentic stories is by making those decisions of reconfiguring your supply chain. We made the rules up. Let's change the rules, you know, about how we pay for things, what's valuable, what's not valuable, and so on. I know it's easy to say, isn't it? It's easy for...
No, but there's only one way to put it, and you've just said it. Right, I'm now jumping over to the Q&A window, because we've also got questions here. So Paul Fawkes Arellano says, how do we stop sustainable fashion experts, and he's put those in inverted commas, from demonizing wool? I haven't eaten meat for decades, but wool is at the very center of my circular footwear projects. Any questions?
Tell him to come and talk to me, for goodness sake. Okay, here's one thing I say. Okay. If you compare worst case scenario of wool to best case scenario of some artificial thing, maybe on a life cycle analysis it looks bad, okay? I'll accept that. But if you can spare best case scenario of wool, there's nothing is going to catch up to that. And best case scenario is regenerative, wildlife friendly wool production, which is already happening around the world. With really great animal welfare, with best case scenario, there are regenerative farms that are negative in terms of carbon. They suck more carbon in than they or methane than they put out, right? And they're restoring soil and water. So best case, that's what we want. We want best case scenario. We're not going to do this silly apples to oranges again. And one other thing, just quickly, is if you want to go on the animal welfare issue, on the animal rights, and I distinguish between welfare and rights. If you don't believe in using animals for fashion or for food, okay, that's an ethical choice that you're making. That is not a scientific choice. that is going to help the world, right? It will help the world to a certain extent, but what we really need to do is support farmers to do farming better and to restore and they're the custodians of the earth and the soil. We need to help foresters do forestry better. We need to reward and support them, right? We need to help local people, you know, who have the land. We need to help them do it better, do what they need to do better. And you can't do that by just turning away and saying, well, you know, I don't want to do that. Yeah. It's a personal choice, but it's not a choice for the world.
Well put, thank you. A question from Natalie Martin. She said she wrote her bachelor thesis about environmental concerns in the fashion industry. This is actually particularly salient. Natalie, I think you mean fast fashion here, so I'm going to correct it to that. I hope that's what you meant. It's particularly salient in light of Cyber Weekend that's just been. How can we make consumers more aware that the fast fashion they are buying is destroying the environment?
Yeah, I would say what we need to do is make consumers aware about how their choices on clothes can be more positive. I don't think demonizing anything, I don't know if that's going to have the difference. It's not like fear doesn't drive people or demonizing things, hope does, or positive. So I think the way forward, and I can say this because I'm older than probably most of you, is I do think we've lost the understanding of materials and fibers. We've lost what that means. So if you start wearing clothes that are made from silk and wool and you start learning about that and learning how it has a positive impact, you're not going to want to wear a lot of you're going to start making different choices. So I think we should be pushing the positive story more about, and not about that and guilting people, but inspiring people. Just a thought.
I like that idea. Positivity is very key to FashMash, particularly this year as well. Right, I think we're only going to have time for one more. I'm so conscious of time. So this is, again, the Q&A window.
Thank you for so many questions.
There are so many, Helen. I think we might have to send you some more via email or DM after. This is from an anonymous attendee. Yeah. Thank you for this fascinating discussion. In terms of the current understanding of impact in terms of carbon emissions, we look at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Yeah. Is there an equivalent in relation to biodiversity supply chain impact scoping? I know that you have further questions, anonymous attendee, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now in terms of time.
Yeah. We'll come back in a year and we'll see where we're at on all this. You'll be able to. So really good questions. So the thing about, and it's funny, we just had a conversation about that today with this task force for nature-related risk, which is about investors figuring out where they're going to put their money so it doesn't go into destroying nature. It's very exciting. One of the things is this scope issue. The thing about nature and about impact in terms of companies is that the most of the impact is going to be around your raw materials. I mean, the Kering EP&L, the Kering Environment Profit and Loss shows that it's at the base of your supply chain where a lot of that's the impact is. That's the interface of business with nature, is where you get your agriculture, forestry, and mined materials. Now, you do have impacts in other places in terms of pollution, like I talked about, water pollution particularly, and drawdown of water use can have an impact on biodiversity. But really the big chunk, it's really about raw materials. So scoping, how we articulate that formally as a scope is still people are still trying to figure it out. But that's where the attention needs to be. Where did my stuff come from?
Right. Thank you. And thank you everyone for all of your questions. This is definitely the most questions we've ever had in this webinar format. So I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but I'm so pleased that Helen incited so many insights and conversation and so many ideas from all of you. So before I hand back to Rachel for a final quick fire round, I just want to say thank you all for attending. Thank you to our Flavio, and most of all, thank you very, very much to Helen and to Rachel for interviewing this evening. Right, Rachel, your finest and quickest quickfire there's ever been.
So Helen, I didn't tell you about this, but we always end on a little quick fire round. So I'm going to give you 2 words and you need to tell me which one you prefer or you think is more important. This is just a bit of fun. Okay, ready? Mm-hmm. Fashion or field? Maybe
Field.
just fashion or forest. Okay.
Field.
Big targets or small actions?
Big targets.
Ooh. I know the answer to this one now. Regenerative agriculture or a fully circular economy?
Regenerative, restorative.
Okay, this one's a little bit of a trick one because I know the answer and nobody in the audience will. Wool jumper or a crocodile handbag?
Depends on depends on where the wool came from.
Okay, so
Crocodile handbag. Crocodile handbag.
I'm going to leave that one hanging because we don't have time. People are going to have to ask you another time as to why you've chosen crocodile handbags. One of my favorite things I learned from you a little while ago. People feel free to follow up with us afterwards. Virgin materials or bio-based solutions?
Oh, virgin materials, hands down.
Great. And I love that as well, because the reason I put this in there is I really wanted people to just have a moment of thought there, because I think a lot of people would have naturally jumped to the innovation.
Virgin natural materials. Sorry, virgin natural.
That's fair. That's fair. Good correction. Yeah. Last one, 2020 or 2050?
2020.
Ah, I didn't expect you to say that. That's wonderful.
You're not 2030, you mean 2020 or 2050? Yeah. This is our leaping off point. This is, we leap and we either thrive or we don't. This is our leaping off point.
Love it. Thank you for bringing such energy and such ambition, and also putting it into a reality for all of us of starting to work with all of this and make it happen by 2030. As you say, now's our jumping off point and we really have no choice but to do so. Hugely appreciate your time. Thank you for bringing such expertise.
Be safe, be well, have a lovely festive season.
Same to you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for watching. Really appreciate you being here in time, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.